In this part of our tutorial, we are going to talk about sessions and implement them in our Express server. Sessions represent the duration of a user on a website. By default, HTTP is stateless. We don't know who is making requests to our server, so we need to be able to track requests and know where they are coming from. One common usage of sessions is to manage user authentication. Sessions are created on the server by generating an object with a session ID. When an HTTP request is sent to the server from the web browser, the response can return with instructions to set a cookie with the session ID so that it can be saved in the browser. This allows the browser to send the cookie on subsequent requests to the server. The server can then parse the cookies from text to JSON, then verify the session ID was sent from the client and determine who the request was sent from. Whenever the browser sends the cookies on each request, the server can look up which user pertains to the session, as the server maintains a mapping of each session ID to the user. We'll get started in implementing sessions using the Express Session library. So the first thing that we're going to do is install the Express Session package. So in my project terminal, I'm going to type npm I express-session. And then we need to go into our index.mjs file, or whatever root file you have where you create the app instance or the Express instance. And then you're going to import session, and then from express-session like that. So this session import is a middleware function, and we can register it by simply just using app.use. So app.use, and then session, just like this. And you want to make sure that you are calling app.use right before you are registering any endpoints in your application. So remember that I'm using this router that is imported from routes right over here. And this file over here has all of my individual routers for products and users. Okay, so what I'm making sure is I'm calling the session middleware function before my routes are being registered. So now the next thing that we want to do is configure some options for Express Session. So the first thing that we will do is set a secret. So I'm going to pass in an object, and so for the secret, this is going to be a string. Now, ideally, you'd want this to be something that is sophisticated because it is used to actually sign the cookie. And if you have it something guessable, someone can easily use that value to decode signed cookies. For now, just for development purposes, I'm just going to use Anson the dev, but just keep in mind you would want this to be something more complicated and not guessable. Kind of like a password. I'm going to set this property called save uninitialized. Now, this property alongside with the next property I'm going to set called resave, both of these have to do with session stores. We currently don't have any session stores configured. By default, Express Session does use an in-memory store, but you want save uninitialized set to false when you don't want to save unmodified session data to the session store. So what that means is, by default, if you have every single user visiting your website and they're not doing anything, they're just visiting it, it will, if you have save uninitialized set to true, it will actually save a session object to the store, even if the session object has nothing at all. And that can actually take up memory, and you probably won't want to have a bunch of random session objects living in your session store. So ideally, you'd want this to be set to false. And it's recommended if you're building something like user authentication, managing user sessions, things like that. The other property that we want to set is resave. Okay, and this really has to do with forcing a session to be saved back to the session store, even if the session itself was never modified at all. You'll better understand what I mean by modifying the session once I show you how to actually do it and what it affects, how it affects the actual session itself. But for now, don't worry about these two properties, just set it to false. The other property that I want to set is this cookie property. And this is where we can actually configure how long we want the cookie to live, because in case if you didn't know, cookies can actually expire. So this is good if you have a user login system where, let's say, you want the user to be logged in to your website a max of 24 hours. So you can set this max age property, and the value is a number and it's measured in milliseconds. So for example, 60,000 milliseconds, that is 60 seconds times let's see, 60. So that's 1 hour. So let's say if I only wanted the user to be logged in for exactly 1 hour, then the cookie will expire after 1 hour and that cookie will no longer be valid. And so whenever they send it back to the server will see that the cookie is not a valid one at all. And remember that the cookie that is sent from the browser to the server is what is being used by the server to identify who the user is. So I'll keep everything simple and use my base URL endpoint. And what I want to do is inside the request handler, and you can use any endpoint you want. I'm just going to go ahead and console log request.session. And I want to console log the session ID as well. So you can either reference session ID or you can reference session.id. And I'm going to go and make one API request to this endpoint. And you'll see that when I make a request, I can see the session object as well as the session ID being logged. And you can see that the session object has this cookie property, which is an object. And you can see that the expiration date is over here. So it's in UTC time. Currently, it's 2:44 a.m. So I think I'm 7 hours behind that time zone. So that would be 9:44 and then expires in 1 hour. So the expiration date time is correct. But let's focus on this session ID right over here. Okay. So I'm going to make another request, and notice how when I make another request, you can actually see that not only does the expiration date update, but also this session ID is regenerated. I can create another one and another one. So every single time I click send, it's going to pretty much like create a new cookie and also create a new session. And this is actually not necessarily good because we never can actually track who the user is that's using our application. So this is where you need to modify the session data object. When you modify the session data object, Express Session will create a cookie, or it will set the cookie, and then that cookie will be sent to the browser or the client side. The client side will store that cookie, and then on subsequent requests or future requests, that cookie will be sent to the server, assuming it has not been expired. Okay. The server, of course, will go through the Express Session middleware, because remember, Express Session is a middleware, so it'll go through this whole session middleware, and then it'll validate that cookie, make sure it's not an invalid cookie. So if the cookie is not expired or if it's not invalid, then Express Session actually won't generate a new session or session ID at all. Okay, so hopefully that part makes sense, because by modifying the session data object, we can begin tracking users that are using our website, our API. If we don't, then we'll just always have generated sessions all the time, brand new sessions all the time. Okay, and remember, if you had save uninitialized set to true, it would save all of these sessions, even if it's not modified, to the session store. So that would use up a lot of memory for no good reason whatsoever. So what I'll do right now is I'm going to modify the session object by just simply referencing request.session, and I can attach dynamic properties onto this session object. So let's do a simple one. I'm going to go ahead and reference visited, and I'll set this to true. And I'm just going to remove the session. Oh, I'll leave everything alone for now. And now watch this. Okay, let me go into my Thunder client, and I want you to take a look at what happens now when I make my first request. So the server just restarted because we're using NodeMon. So whenever I make changes, it'll restart the server. But I just made one request, and you can see this is my cookie, and this is my session ID. Notice how now when I make a new request every single time, you see how now the session ID is the same every single time. Okay, every single time I make a request, session ID is the same. And the reason why this is good is because now I can actually track the user. You can see that we have this visited property on the session object. And since the ID is not going to be generated every single time, the server itself knows what the session ID is. They can look up the session ID and attach the correct session data to the incoming request object. So we'll know who which user is. So let me show you an example, okay? So what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead into any endpoint right now. I can go into any endpoint. And what I want to show you is if I go into, let's do /API/users. So this endpoint gets a list of all the users. And I'll just console log request.session and request.sessionID. And I'm going to go back into my Thunder client. So remember, the server just restarted. So because we are not using a persistent data store for our sessions, everything gets wiped out because everything is currently in memory. So I'm going to go ahead and click send for our base URL. I'm going to make a request to the base URL first because that is the endpoint that will actually set the cookie for us. Okay, it'll modify the session data, which will set the cookie and then send it back to the client. So if I click send, okay, you can see that I have my cookie generated right over here. And also, if I click on cookies on Thunder Client, and if you're using the browser or if you're using Postman, you can also look at the cookies yourself. But you see how I have this cookie right over here. And you'll notice how everything after these, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. You'll see that everything after these first 4 characters, all the way up until this dot, so this whole thing right over here is actually our session ID. You can see that they match. If I put them side by side, you can see that they match right over here. And then, of course, everything over here is the signature of the cookie because it's signed. All right, so now that we have our cookie from the server, now I want to show you what happens when I visit a completely different endpoint. So let's go to API/users because that's where we're also logging the session data as well. Okay, so right now we have a cookie. We're sending that cookie to the server. The server is going to make sure that cookie is a valid cookie. And if there's any data for that session ID that was retrieved from the cookie that was sent to the server, if there's any data in the session store, it's going to map it to that incoming request object. Okay, so basically this session object comes from the session store essentially. It kind of gets restored. But let me make a request. So I just made a request just now. And notice how when I made that request, okay, I get the same exact cookie right over here. Okay, you see how I have the same session ID in a completely different endpoint. You see how this object now logs visited true, whereas before the previous one didn't, obviously, because we didn't have a cookie set properly when we visited this base URL. Okay, but when I visit this base URL, we modify the session object. So then that will set the cookie and send it to the browser. We make another request to the user's API. So when we do make that request, request.session now has that visited true property set, and it has the same exact session ID. So it's important to understand this because now we can actually build out some kind of authentication system and know who each user is. One more thing that I do want to show you is I want to show you the session store currently. So remember that by default, the session store is in memory, so it saves everything in some data structure and it lives on the server. And of course, this is not good because when it's volatile, so if the server goes down, and you may have seen this already, we have to visit the website again and have a new session created for us. So I just want to show you this real quick. So let me reference console.log request.session store. And I'm going to call this get method, and I can pass in any session ID. Okay. And then let's see, we have to pass in a callback function. So that's okay. Let me actually do this instead. So I'm going to pass in request.session.id and a callback function. So let's see, error and session data. And I'll just do if error, throw error. And then I want to console log the session data, just so you all can see what this looks like. All right, so now let me do this in my browser. Okay, so I have these cookies set, which are not going to be valid anymore because we just restarted the database. So now if I go to the base URL first, we have the cookie set. And let me just kind of go to my console and scroll down. Okay, so this is our session ID. Now if I'll go to the user's endpoint, okay, same cookies. But notice how this is coming from this part right over here, line 29. So notice how when I call request.sessionstore.get, I can pass in any session ID. And of course, if it exists, then it will give it to us, which I'm logging it right over here on line 29. So that's where it's coming from. Okay, so that is how the session store stores these session object data. So I hope that makes sense because I really want you all to see this visually, because just by saying it, it kind of doesn't really help you understand how things are being saved underneath the hood. But at least it helps you better understand that now we can see that this session data is stored in some data structure on the server in memory. But in later parts of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use an actual database to store the session data. So that way, when your server goes down, the session data gets restored.